This is Podcast Theory.
Hello again, fellow podcaster, and welcome back to Podcast Theory. I am your host, Jason Sircone, and today I'm here to deliver some bittersweet news. Now, if you are a loyal and avid fan of Podcast Theory, thank you for that, first of all. But you've probably noticed over the past few weeks there have been no new episodes coming out. And here's why. Okay, so here's what I've decided to do with Podcast Theory going forward. And this really, it wasn't a hard decision. It was just one of those epiphanies. It hit me one day. I was sitting in a networking meeting and I have pre-recorded episodes of Podcast Theory set to go live every Thursday when I'm in this meeting. So they go live. They're already set up and ready to go for your consumption. And I was sitting in the meeting and I got the alert that the episode went live. So everything was good. And for whatever reason, it just hit me. Dude, you're doing two podcasts about the same thing. And I just said, well, why are you doing that? It's kind of weird. So to give you some backstory here. Podcast Theory, this poor podcast, I swear to God, I feel so bad, which it's almost to the point where it's like this has become such a good resource that I'm obviously going to let it live on in archive form because it's got loyal listeners and loyal watchers just like you consuming the content on a daily basis. But here's the deal. So to give you the timeline of what I've been doing with Podcast Theory, when I first launched the show back in 2021, 2020, it was known as Pod Theory. And I ran that as a daily 5-day-a-week show with 5 to 10-minute episodes. And the idea was to share as much podcast knowledge as possible. Every 30th episode, I would bring on a guest. So really, the idea was to create a resource that would help aspiring podcasters on the brand side of things, on the hobbyist side of things, get some advice and knowledge and strategy and just some overall guidance from someone who's been doing podcasting for a long time. It's funny I say that because when I think about it, it's like, dude, you should have known when you started that you probably could have done a better name. So Pod Theory was something that just rolled off the tongue. It was real easy, but didn't necessarily describe that it was about podcasting. Nevertheless, show took off. Things were going well. And then I switched course to another podcast known as Evolution of Brand. And I had some plans on what to do with Pod Theory, but was not sure when and where I was going to execute said plans. Got going with Evolution of Brand, really got into the conversations I was having. I jumped on Podmatch and was making some incredible connections and then bringing those folks on the show. Evolution of Brand really took over. So Pod Theory went to the wayside for a bit. Then I brought it off the shelf and did a second season, and the concept of doing that season was to bring on a featured co-host. I was laying out season 2 and I had some guests in mind that I wanted to feature, but then I realized, man, you do this, this is 9 or 10 people you've got to reach out to and schedule and then record with. And believe me, there's nothing wrong with that. But as I looked at my plan, as I was drawing it out, I wondered, could I be more efficient in this department? And decided, yes, I could. And decided to bring on a featured co-host. And what that meant was having one person do the whole season with me gave me an opportunity to have someone else's voice shine through for multiple episodes. We could get together and plan out what we wanted to talk about. And it made things much easier because I only needed to connect with one person and line everything up. And the recording sessions ended up being great because we were able to bang out the whole season over, I believe it was 3 total recording sessions. And that's how season 2 came to life. I had Travis Brown, a good buddy of mine, join me on the show. We talk about myths and misconceptions of podcasting. It's all available in the archives. You can go back and listen to that. And then I realized I love this format. This is what I want to do. I want to bring this to life in that type of capacity. And that just never came together. And one thing led to another, and Pod Theory just sort of vanished again. And I knew when I launched Bombtrack Media, I wanted to bring Podcast Theory back, and I wanted to bring it back with that rebranded name. And that's what we did. We brought Podcast Theory back. Now, the idea with this show was to focus on the ins and outs of podcasting, whether it was just solo episodes like you're consuming right now, or to feature a guest who's utilized podcasting and could share their wealth of knowledge with you. And as the series started to come together, or as this podcast started to come back together, Let's Blow This Up, which is my other show, was starting to trend more towards people in the podcasting space wanting to join me for great conversations about how they've leveraged podcasting. And I said, okay, what I could do in that case is start talking on Let's Blow This Up about all these great podcasting elements. And then podcast theory could be more solo based, or I could do the featured co-host thing and we could zero in on a certain subject. And that was really where I felt things could go. Well, then all of a sudden, as I said, when I kicked this off, the epiphany hit me. Man, I am doing 2 shows focused on the same thing. Why, by definition, divide the audience? Now, I'm not saying that there's no crossover, because I know there is. I've had people tell me they listened to both shows, which was just another reason why I decided maybe this would be better if this was all under one umbrella instead of dividing the efforts of myself in regards to production. Why not put this on one podcast network, one platform, one show? And that's why I say this poor freaking podcast. I feel so bad because so much of what I've done with podcast theory, formerly known as pod theory, I would advise and coach to do the opposite. And I'm not saying that there wasn't strategy in mind. It was just there was a number of different things and a number of different directions that I went, or ultimately pod theory / podcast theory ended up being the show that got pushed to the side. So I laugh at this because honestly, putting this show together has been a labor of love, and I've loved every single second of it because it's allowed me to talk about podcasting in my own way. It's my show, obviously, so it gives me the stage to bring my thoughts and my views and my predictions about podcasting to the forefront. But when I launched Bombtrack Media at the end of 2023, I knew Let's Blow This Up was going to be one of the podcasts that I wanted to have as part of my approach to creating content and obviously having my own podcast. Let's Blow This Up was never designed to be a show about podcasting. Let's Blow This Up was designed to talk more to business owners, entrepreneurs, professionals in a number of different spaces. And each season was going to zero in on different themes, not anything to do with podcasts. Now, if podcasting were to work its way in, great. In fact, now that I think back on this, season 2 was going to be dedicated to nothing but podcasting. And then season 3 would go on to the next thing and the next thing and so on and so forth. But what ended up happening was a lot of my connections are in the podcast space. So they're already leveraging podcasting for their brand. It made complete sense for them to talk about how that's worked for them and how that's been such a benefit for their practices. So the content of Let's Blow This Up just naturally shifted to podcast talk because that's where I am every day anyway. So short story long, as I realized as I was sitting in that BNI meeting, I've got 2 podcasts about the same thing, and I think it's time to make a couple changes. So I actually, after that meeting, made a couple outreach messages right away and asked about combining show networks and combining the efforts of 2 podcasts into one. Has this been done? Is it an easy transition? What am I in for? And unfortunately, the answers I got didn't really deliver what I was looking for. So I had to put some thought into this. And that's where I've been for the past few weeks, trying to determine what is the best way to proceed, not just for me from an efficiency standpoint, but for you as a consumer. Ideally, I would like you to be part of one podcast experience with me. And it got me thinking, since Let's Blow This Up is now trended towards and now is completely all in on podcasting and how it can benefit your brand and how you can utilize it to grow your business, amplify your message, all those good things. What can I do with Let's Blow This Up that brings in elements of podcast theory and delivers it all under one umbrella? And that's what I've been working on for the early part of 2025. So here's what's going to happen here. First off, again, I started off by saying thank you for being a listener of Podcast Theory. Can't thank you enough for being here through all the iterations and changes and layoffs and putting it on the back burner and bring it back to the front burner. If you've been loyal to this show, I cannot thank you enough for that. Believe me, this is not goodbye. You're going to get even more of me with the changes I'm going to make. However, I want you to understand what's happening here on Podcast Theory because you've been a loyal viewer, you've been a loyal listener. I want to make sure that you're the first to know where this is going to go. So I'm coming to you today to let you know what is happening as we proceed. How I'm going to wrap up this show is as follows. I got this episode today. Tomorrow, I'm going to start a 6-part series on critical elements that you need to be cognizant of before you launch your podcast. If you've listened to any of the content here on the show, you know a lot of the focus lately has been how poorly launch strategies are executed, and not before we get to execution, poorly planned. So many people throw out test balloons to see if one episode brings in 1 million listeners, and then when it doesn't, the instant response is, well, this doesn't work. Let's do something else. I want you to understand the power that goes into a solid, well-curated launch strategy, and then how to go beyond that launch strategy. It's not just about getting started. It's about building a solid foundation on which you can build the tallest building in the world. There's a lot to cover, but I'm going to condense it into 6 episodes of the most important points. So wrapping up Podcast Theory in a strong way. Got today's episode letting you know what's up. The next 6 episodes over the next few weeks are going to be dedicated to 6 different components of a solid launch strategy. And then I'll do a final farewell episode. But as I said, this is not goodbye. This is just see you later. Because if you're a fan of this show, really, you should be listening to Let's Blow This Up as well. And I highly encourage you to subscribe and click the bell on YouTube so you know when we go live with new episodes of Let's Blow This Up every Wednesday at 7 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time on this YouTube channel, on this Facebook channel, and on this LinkedIn channel. You can get those episodes live as we put them together. The podcast version, if you're listening to this episode of Podcast Theory, just go subscribe to Let's Blow This Up, or just make sure you're checking in every Friday for new episodes of the show in podcast form. I plan on wrapping up season 2 of I plan on wrapping up season 2 of Let's Blow This Up on Wednesday, November 6th. My good friend Jay Franzi, if you've listened to Let's Blow This Up, you've heard his voice on a couple past episodes. He's going to join me, and we're going to talk about all of the different ins and outs of making big changes like this to your podcast. Because inevitably, if you're doing a podcast right now, more than likely, somewhere down the line, you're going to want to make a few tweaks and a few adjustments. We're going to talk about how to do that with confidence. But all in all, I love hanging out with Jay. We've done so many podcast collaborations together between my shows and his. It's always a good time when we get together, and I get to harass him a little bit about the Yankees making the World Series. He is a Red Sox fan. Hopefully, by the time that episode goes live, the Yankees are celebrating another championship. Stay tuned. But nevertheless, that's going to be how I wrap up season 2 of Let's Blow This Up. The next week will be the final episode of Podcast Theory. Then I'm going to take a short break for the holidays, and I'll be back with you for season 3 of Let's Blow This Up in February of 2025. When Let's Blow This Up returns, I've got some great content set to come your way because, as I said, the goal in combining the 2 shows was to bring elements of both podcasts to Let's Blow This Up. And that's exactly what's going to happen. So I'm going to lay out exactly what I plan to do with season 3 of Let's Blow This Up on that season finale episode with Jay Franzi. So if you haven't listened to Let's Blow This Up yet, I'm telling you, and I'm not even trying to toot my own horn, the conversations that I've got the opportunity to have with so many incredible podcasters have been through the roof. They've been so much fun. You can benefit so much from the knowledge of these folks, and the conversations we've had have been engaging. There's been great back and forth, and it's really been a ton of fun to put that content together. So if you're not dialed in to Let's Blow This Up, I highly recommend you do that the second you're done listening to this episode of Podcast Theory. So, quick recap. Let's Blow This Up is going to be the show. Now, am I going to be launching another show down the road in 2025? Yeah, but I'm not talking about that now. That's a story for another day. And honestly, you could go listen to an episode of Let's Blow This Up where I laid out what I wanted to do going forward for 2024 and beyond. Don't bother. It's very seldom to hear somebody say, don't listen to this episode, right? I'm calling an audible, a big audible, based on what I talked about in that episode. But as I said, elements of this show that have made podcast theory what it is are going to be found within Let's Blow This Up. And I'm very excited to roll out that content because honestly, the way I plan on doing it, I haven't seen it done. Now, I'm not saying it's never been done, but I just haven't seen it myself. Like NBC, right? I haven't seen it. It's new to me. Hopefully, it's new to you as well. So, what I recommend you do now, strap in for what's going to be the final 7 episodes of Podcast Theory over the next few weeks as we wind this show down and I retire it for good this time. Believe me, this is going to be living as a resource. I'm still going to draw content from it. It's going to be out there for you to listen to, but no new episodes of Podcast Theory are going to take place. We are going to finally retire this poor show, which has gone through so many changes and iterations over the years. But Let's Blow This Up is going to be the podcast marketing, podcast production destination show that you absolutely want to be a part of. So get an early jump on things. Go subscribe now. Go find the show on YouTube. Find the show on your favorite podcast app. Go to bombtrackmedia.com/let's blow this up, and you can get connected to the show wherever you desire. So that's going to do it for today's episode of Podcast Theory. Thank you so much for everything you've done to make this podcast what it is today. And thank you for everything that you're going to do as we transition from Podcast Theory over to Let's Blow This Up full time. Can't wait for February 2025. Can't wait for February 2025 to a point where I can't even talk. But we got plenty to happen. Plenty of things to happen before we get to that point. I hope you're strapped in for one hell of a ride. And I know you have been to this point. Thank you so much for that. Until our paths cross again as we kick off the 6 critical elements you should be thinking about before you launch your podcast on the next episode. My name is Jason Sircone. This has been Podcast Theory. Good talk. I will see you out there.